welcome to this webinar. This is part of the Leading Through Crisis series, and I'm Stephan Meier, and I'm joined here by Dan Wang. We're both in the management group teaching core strategy most of the time, and we're going to talk in this webinar a little bit about strategic leadership across business and society. So in the last couple of months, Dan and I have not only experienced, as we all did, the pandemic and that we had to work from home, but also, you know, the recent events, or like put a spotlight on inequality within the US and across the globe, and systemic discrimination. And we have been thinking in the last couple of months a lot how to deal with those two issues for businesses. In particular, when we thought about like bringing our core class to this high flex model or even remote before, thought a lot about what is lost in this remote work that we are doing in the teaching front, but also then, you know, kind of what are our different expertise that we can bring to this to this area. So we're going to talk today a little bit about first what I research, which has to do with work and meaning at work, and then we transition then to Dan, who's going to talk about social movements and how that affects businesses going forward. There is a Q&A box, so whenever you have any questions, just put it in the Q&A box, and at the end of our discussion that we're going to have, we're going to open it up for more questions. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to Dan. Dan, take it away.
Thanks, Stephan. I think it's okay if I say that I could speak for you by saying that we're both incredibly excited to be here, in part because Professor Meier and I have been teaching this course together alongside one another as colleagues, developing materials for it as well for the past 8 years. Stephan arrived at CBS before me, so he has even more experience than I do. But one interesting point that I want everyone to keep in mind is that Professor Meier and I come from two very different intellectual traditions, yet we find ourselves teaching the same course. He's a behavioral economist, as you'll see in some of his work in just a minute, and I'm an organizational sociologist. Yet, despite that we think about the world differently, there are common touch points that we're going to talk about today. And so just a word on the format today is that before everyone else has a chance to engage in question and answer, what Stephan and I will do will be constantly interrupting each other. So it'll just be like normal times when he and I talk. So you'll be seeing Stephan's slides, you'll be seeing my slides, but you can expect us to interrupt one another with questions as well. And so I'm excited to be here and share with you our perspectives from our research, others' research, and how it relates to everything that you're seeing in the classroom as well. So thanks, Stephan. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay, perfect. So why don't I start? And I'm going to share my slides. So I'm going to use some slides to just help me a little bit, like having some structure in that. I hope you're going to see now the slides. So I'm going to kick it off by talking some of my work and my recent thinking about how the pandemic and the experience that we had during the pandemic kind of affects kind of how we work together, and also what it means for like meaning and work and job preferences. So as Dan mentioned, you know, I'm a behavioral economist, so I would like to think about myself that I look at the human side of strategy, how psychology and economics affect organizations and strategy in particular. There are, of course, many aspects to that, but today I want to talk about two. One is how does working together work, and can we make them predictions about how this new normal will going to work out? Can we go remote and virtual or not? And second, I'm going to talk a little bit about like what meaning of work really means, and how people different, how it's shaped. Now, of course, we know work is an important part of everybody's life. Not only if you look at the time that we spend at work, but also, you know, the identity we get from work, the purpose we get from work. Now, when you think about work, and that kind of brings me to the thesis that when I think about whether we're going to go virtual and how much we're going to virtual, is community is a really important aspect. Belonging is a really important aspect if we think about how working together really works. That, like, you know, we have to think about, like, why do we for many, many years brought people to the office? And I think there are basically two reasons. One is to coordinate. We have to kind of be aligned. When I work with Dan on a new class, I have to make sure that he understands what I do, I understand what he do. We share information in the process to make sure that we're all aligned in what is the class going to be like and what we're going to do. The second part is cooperation. We need some motivation to go like the extra mile. If you think about successful organizations, most of them have to do with, you can't just write down everything in a contract and then monitor. You need to rely that people share, mentor each other, share information, help each other out. And that then leads together to like helping, information sharing, new ideas being generated. And I think if we think about more systematically why we brought people together, I think then we can potentially make predictions about what is going to happen if we can't bring them together. Should we continue doing it all virtual or not?
So, Stephan, I thought these distinctions between coordination and cooperation were really clear. And having read some of your work, I think you emphasized the importance of them. My question to you is, how did these two things go together to make the workplace more functional, productive, and efficient?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like to rephrase it, what do we actually know about what increases cooperation or coordination in the workplace? And there is where like this aspect of community really kick in. If you look at coordination, of course, like that's what we teach at the moment to our students, like having a clear strategy that tells people what is actually the objective organization, makes sure that we know in what direction to march. So routines, strategy are really important. On top of it, getting a sense of belonging, knowing each other really helps in that coordination. So what you see here on the screen is a study that I didn't do, but is an important one on this coordination aspect. And when you look at the y-axis, it kind of shows, how much coordination, let's say there is. And on the left-hand side, you see those are minimal groups. There are people who come together, but there is no real community aspect to that. And you see that coordination is not as high as it could be. In fact, it goes down over time. However, on the right-hand side, you see that's groups who actually have meaningful interaction, know each other well, and then coordination efforts are much higher without even needing a leader who actually tells them what to do. I think that just shows you really clearly that like community is important. That's not only in the coordination. I think when you think about cooperation, it's even more important. When you think about cooperation, let's think about like helping each other to a cost to myself, which is not contractually obliged. I don't need to, nothing in my contract tells me that I need to help Dan in his research or his work or his teaching. However, I'm going to do that. Normally what you see, and this is the left-hand side of this particular graph, is that people start helping out to a relatively high degree. But over time, that helping cooperation actually goes down. It's not sustainable. The only way to make this sustainable, one way, is if we work together. If there is some peer enforcement, I'm actually in the office, tell Dan that he should help or not, and so forth. That then reaches this relatively high level of cooperation. Now, in addition, I did a bunch of research showing that coming together is important, but what really is the kicker is like if we actually know each other. Trust is an important aspect. Think about sharing information. If I share information or help Dan, I need to trust that he's going to reciprocate that he's going to help me the next time. That particular trust is an important aspect of getting cooperation particularly high. Now,
so, Stephan,
yes.
One really interesting question here, and I think you might speak to this, is how can you then generate trust in not a physical environment? Because it seems that if this is so key to making cooperation and coordination work, it seems like there would be barriers to that when we move online.
I couldn't agree more. I actually think that like going virtual, if cooperation is really important, this in-person meeting is going to be very important. Now, of course, what do we know really about remote work? Not so much so far, but there are a couple of, first we know that those high trust organizations really help for productivity and whatever. How does that translate to impact, remote work and the impact of that? There is a very few studies who actually study this in a rigorous way. One interesting and important one comes from a Chinese call center, where they randomly assign people who wanted to work from home, that half can work from home and the other half can. Now, what you see is that productivity actually goes up, for all the reasons we just experienced. You know, a lot, like 9% comes from you can actually work more because you don't have to commute, you have more time at home. You know, the half an hour to an hour of commute, you can actually put into some productive work. The second comes from, in the call center setting, you know, 4% is like you take more calls per minute. You're in a quiet environment, you don't get disrupted with others. So all those positive aspects of remote work actually can. That leads to work satisfaction and less retention. However, there is also flip sides to that, and one has to do also with particular the work. One flip side is if you're not in the office, you don't get promoted as much. Kind of out of mind, out of sight, out of mind. Again, of two classes of workers: those who come together in the office, share information, go for lunch breaks, and those who are not there. You know, we all know the feeling that you're calling into a meeting where like people meet physically. You know, the most important aspect of the meeting takes place before and after the meeting. And if you're not there, you kind of are shut out of that meeting. Also important, after that experiment here in the call center, they allowed people to select whether they still want to continue work from home, and half said no. We actually would prefer to come back. Now, but the important aspect of this job is this is a very particular job. Call centers need not as much coordination. Whether I do my calls does not depend on Dan's job. It also doesn't need that much cooperation because it's not a creative task. I can actually observe everything I do on the call. It gets recorded. It doesn't need as much like going the extra effort than in other jobs. So while we know from that study that there are those positive aspects of working from home, it also points to some of the limitations. And in particular, it comes from a very particular job that needs actually a little less coordination and less cooperation going forward. Now the question is then, you know, what should the new normal look like? How can we make predictions what is going to happen? I think when you buy into that argument that, like, you know, this community and trust really matters, you can think about, if you're a leader yourself, or if you want to make prediction of what most likely jobs are going to go remote or not, and think about how important is coordination and cooperation. You know, here I put like this matrix on, which like need for cooperation on one, and need for coordination on one, and need for cooperation on the other one. If it's low on both, you can go virtual. Think call centers. You know, like you're in a call center or gig work in general. There is very little that we need to coordinate between employees, and there is very little we need like cooperation effort. When you're on the upper right corner, you know, where you need a lot of coordination and you need a lot of cooperation, that means like creative tasks and whatever, then it's, to me, I expect that we're going to go back to the office because that's just the most efficient way of sharing information or not. What is now interesting, and where I put questions mark, are on the off diagonals. You know, let's say there is a job which needs not that much cooperation, but a lot of coordination. What's going to happen there? Well, we need to be aligned. Is this possible to do remote? Maybe a little bit. Community is important, but like clear routines, clear strategy will probably affect that we can do much more remote than we thought so. On the lower right corner, when we need a lot of trust and a lot of cooperation to create those new ideas, but not as much coordination, I'm a little bit more skeptical that we can do most of that on a remote set. But in going forward, I think organizations will have to figure out how important is one or the other. Why do we people bring to the office in the first place? And what can we do remote and whatnot? That brings me to the second point, you know, how to create those communities. Are like Zoom communities a good substitutes for those real communities? And my answer would be not so much. We can do a lot of Zoom, but we know, you get like Zoom fatigue pretty fast. It's also not exactly the same than if you're in the office. I'm a proud member of Columbia Business School. I do everything for the school. Maybe not everything, but a lot for the school.
He does everything.
Because I feel a lot of identity. It's not in my contract, but I really feel like it. But part of it is like, I know the people personally. I feel connected to them. And whether you can do that on remote is not so clear. In fact, Dan and I are working in this moment about like how networks are structured differently when you have in-person meeting than when you do everything virtual. Still, you see each other on Zoom, but it's just very different. And last but not least, people really differ in what makes them productive and how they can deal with virtual versus not. Some really look forward to this in-person interactions, and others can do a little bit more from home. And I think that's important to realize. Not every worker, not every employee is the same. And you can, in my household, I'm very different from my wife. I have 3 kids, and they're very different from each other, how much social interactions they need. And that's going to be important when we think going forward, who to bring back and how to bring people back to the office. Dan?
So I'm thinking about some of this stuff, and I'm thinking about how what you're saying is related to different aspects of what employees get out of their jobs. One aspect that you kind of talked about is that there are these non-pecuniary benefits of how people treat the incentives of work. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how that relates to their motivation and how that relates to kind of internal coordination as well, in the sense that do people who, for example, get more meaning from work, are they more productive? Are they happier? How does this affect them? And how does this differ from firm to firm? And how does this differ, across other kinds of markets?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually a great segue into what I'm gonna talk about. I do think people differ a lot in what they get out of work, and there is more systematic work in kind of understanding this, and that brings me kind of what I talk about, what I think at the moment about this experience, and also how the pandemic as one experience, or like the recession we're most likely gonna enter, how that affects kind of how we think about it. Now, when you look at kind of job attributes, your own job or my job, if I in introspection, there are basically 3 buckets of aspects to it. One is just the monetary aspect. How much money I get paid, what's the security of that job, how much I get promoted, and whatnot. There is kind of the job design. How is the work organized? How much autonomy do I get? What initiatives can I do? And then the third is kind of the purpose of the job. What's the mission of the organization? Do I go home or do I go in the morning when I go to the office? Am I like excited what I'm actually doing in terms of what the firm is producing? And there is a bunch of surveys that we now started to analyze on that. This is like one question that get asked. Tell me what's the one thing that is most important that you prefer in a job. And there comes from income to like meaning. Work important gives a feeling of accomplishment. And then it asks people over a long period of time how they think about this. And when you look at this, is in the U.S. This is a repeated cross section. So they ask like every couple of years. Ask a bunch of 1,000 people, Americans, about that. And you see that income and meaning is the most important. In fact, meaning is the most important aspect of it that's got to ask. If you then ask what's the second and the third and the fourth aspect of it, there's about 50% that have like income in the top 2, and almost 70% have like meaning in the top 2. And there is even differences now. Now it's interesting to know where those differences come from, because some put income really high, some put meaning really high. There are even differences, there are gender differences, for example. This is another study I did with my colleague Vanessa Borbano and Nicolas Padilla, who's going to start at London Business School. When we look at whether men and female differ, and they do, but they mainly differ on purpose, what we call like purpose differences. So what you see in the graph is kind of the difference between the men and women, and if it's positive, women rated much more highly. And there's basically very little differences on like monetary aspects. They're basically the same. The big difference really kicks in when you think about purpose. Help is the job that helps others or is useful for society. Now, the interesting aspect that I'm now thinking about a lot recently is the experience of a recession, or when we just go through like an extremely bad macroeconomic time. How does that kind of affect how we think about those different job attributes? What you're going to see here is this question about that I posed to you before, rate the most important one, income, and so forth, over time. The dotted line shows, this is in the US, the dotted line shows you the unemployment rate in the United States. And what you see here is a pretty cyclical pattern. When unemployment, not so surprisingly, when unemployment rate goes high, income becomes more important and vice versa. When unemployment becomes lower, income becomes a little bit less important and meaning becomes a little bit more important. That's just shows you that, right now, if you would ask people, and not so surprisingly, if you're happy enough to have a job, and a lot are not as happy because they lost their job, if you still have one, income becomes more and more important. What I think is more interesting is to see, how that the experience where we have now affects people in the future. Does that shape kind of how we think about meaning? And so in this work I did, we looked at, when you grew up in those, what psychologists call like the impressionable years, between like 18 and 25, when most of our attitudes get like shaped. What was the economy like back then? So that we go back to like the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, whenever you were born, and then look at what was the economy like when you were 18 to 25. Turns out that particular experience that you had at this point shapes your preferences for jobs for the rest of your life. When you grew up in a bad times, that actually makes income more important for the rest of your life and meaning less important. Now that has implications, if we think about generations, but also implications on what do we think the experience right now that a lot of young people, enter the job market in those terrible times, how that will shape their preferences going forward. You can look at generations, here I plotted kind of the unemployment rate. And you also see, you often hear like millennials are so different. Turns out, they're lucky and unlucky millennials. Some millennials actually grew up in bad times, and some grew up in good times. Generation X's, a lot of them grew up in good times, but some not. Those who enter the job market right now enter the market in a bad time. That recession really shapes the attitudes for a very long time to come. And I think that's important for leaders to take into account, because that's going to shape how the workforce and what we need to offer to our employees to motivate them, to make them come to job and give their best.
Mm-hmm. So let me just kind of repeat one last point that you just said. That was really interesting and illuminating. But do you think then that relationship between the amount of meaning that an employee gets from a workplace, company values, all of these things, does that affect their productivity then in different ways for different individuals across different eras? Is that how we ought to think about this?
I think that's exactly how we think about that. First, people differ. Not everybody gets a kick out of, or thinks like purpose is as important. Mm-hmm. Probably everybody mm-hmm. thinks it's important, but in the trade-off between income and purpose, people think differently about those trade-offs. And that means like, in order to whether that increases the productivity or not, depends on the individual and the type of employee that you get.
I see.
But also over the generation, and that's what also fascinated me always about your work, Dan, because you talk a lot about, in the last couple of months, we saw like large social movements, large shifts, as I mentioned at the beginning, spotlights on inequality. And that most likely affects like how we think about employees and different stakeholders. within the organization,
Oh,
right?
absolutely. I think that's right. And I think that's one of the most obvious touch points between our two kind of intellectual perspectives. And let me give you some time to stop sharing your screen right now, because I want to share a couple of items with everyone here as well. In part that you would think that a focus based on kind of the human side of strategy, as it were, all comes from an understanding of bias and within and how this shapes our incentives in the workplace. The reason why Stephan and I think enjoy working with each other so much is because we have fundamentally different ways of thinking about the world, but in some strange ways they become compatible. And so whereas Stephan gave you this human side of strategy, I want to tell everyone about the social side of strategy. Stephan is a behavioral economist, taking cues from psychologists as well as the work of economists. I come from the perspective of organizational sociology. Over the past 11 years or so, I've been studying social movements, and I've been studying social movements as if they were organizations. Most of my work has to do with looking at the structure, connections, resources, know-how that social movements build, just like big companies, and taking that perspective on how social movements build capabilities gives you a lot of insight into why some of them are successful and why some of them aren't successful in terms of advancing their causes. Now, separate from that, I think another way that we can think about social movements is that they affect business and society in profound ways. And so one of the key animating questions that we should all be concerned about, especially given the events this summer, as well as the events that are ongoing around social turmoil, as well as anti-police brutality, is that why should organizations and business leaders even pay attention to social movements to begin with? Aren't they occurring in the streets? Aren't they outside? To be clear, when I say a social movement, what I'm referring to is something pretty specific. I'm not talking about a riot. I'm not talking about a mob. I think those are the wrong ways to characterize social protests and social movements. Those types of activities don't get things done. But what a social movement is, and for many scholars who study this, is that it's a sustained, organized, and collective campaign to voice a political or social concern. To go back to this question of why we as organizational business leaders, and for many of our students who are about to hold these positions of authority, why should we pay attention to protest and organized forms of dissent on our streets, is that typically there are two reasons that you read about if you pay close attention to the news. And I want to talk about dispelling maybe the premise of some of these two reasons. And so the first reason is that businesses, the reason we should pay attention, should do more for society. And the reason why I think we should rethink this kind of perspective is that it comes from this fundamental kind of view of how business and society are related. And I'm going to call this the trade-off view. And it goes like this. It basically suggests that there is kind of business on one side, and business essentially, because of market forces, non-market forces, affects one another through competition. And as a result, we have different ways of sustaining value capture and value creation in the long term. For those of you who are taking strategy, that's what this class is about. But on the other side, you have society. And in society, there are policymakers, activist groups, and other elements of civil society that govern how things are supposed to be. And these two spheres are often treated separately. Occasionally they cross over. Businesses sometimes do things that negatively impact society. Sometimes they do things that positively impact society. And so, for example, economists tend to call these externalities. When businesses pollute, they produce environmental harm. When businesses such as pharmaceutical firms decide to engage in corporate social responsibility, all of our first-year students have now had the Eli Lilly case and become familiar with the topic. That creates positive externalities for society. But ultimately, what you get is that there's a trade-off between business and society. And what I think this ignores is that at a fundamental level, business and society are closely interlinked. They exist within another and they exist together as well. And so this idea that businesses should do more for society should be revised in the sense that businesses and societies, because they are interlinked, whatever action a business leader takes, it will affect society. Whatever action a policymaker makes, it will have ramifications for businesses. So rather than talking about this in terms of ought and should, we should be understanding the consequences of all of these actions coming from both parts of the world. That's point number one. The second kind of reason that you hear all the time that why business leaders should pay attention to social protests and social movements is that consumers will boycott your business. It'll be bad for your image. And the number one kind of example that's brought up about this is what happened to McDonald's in the 1990s, or should I say from the 1980s through the 1990s. Some of you who kind of remember this period might remember that if you went to McDonald's in the 1980s or early 1990s, you would be able to get a Happy Meal or a burger in one of these. The thing on the right is what became known as McDonald's clamshell styrofoam burger container. And it was throughout the 1980s and 1990s that because of environmental activists and lobbyist groups, that this had become a, quote, symbol of ecological evil, such that in 1990, McDonald's ceased using styrofoam almost altogether. In fact, the last piece of styrofoam that made its exit was as recent as 2 years ago. And so McDonald's went from one of the biggest polluters in the world because of styrofoam to becoming a slightly less worse producer by moving from styrofoam to paper. This boycott or this kind of consumer effort worked. It took the input of a number of different groups, but in reality, those of us who have studied boycotts know that the answer to the question of do boycotts work is a lot more kind of complicated than this.
And
yeah.
Why don't boycott work, or do we understand kind of when they work more than when they really work and when they don't work?
Intuitively, they should work. Intuitively, business leaders should be responding to their consumers when they say, we don't like something that you're doing, such as using styrofoam for your containers. But ultimately, the question is much trickier than that. And there are many reasons why boycotts sometimes fail. But one of the big reasons has to do with the fact that most consumers tend to dissociate the political and social causes of the companies that they're patrons of, and as well as the functions of the companies themselves. And so there's a large proportion of consumers in general who are just impervious to social concerns. The other aspect of this is that even though some consumers might be might respond to certain cues from companies, there's a level of inauthenticity that always comes from companies engaging in corporate social responsibility. And ultimately, this creates a dilemma for many consumers insofar as they rely on corporations and businesses for the needs of their everyday lives, but at the same time, they also want to be able to buy into a system that aligns with their own values. And because of these two reasons, from the consumer side, boycotts don't have as much efficacy as we would kind of expect. But to kind of summarize this point and where I want to kind of go forward is that the kind of first reason that businesses should do more for society, I think one implication here is that we should think about how businesses and society are intertwined with one another. And it's not that they should be doing more, but that they are already doing a lot. And what we don't understand yet is how the relationship between their actions ramify through both of these spheres. The second element here, which is that, well, if you don't do something, if you don't pay attention to social movements, then your consumers will boycott your business. Well, number one, we have to think usually that's not that effective, but also as a business leader, we should think about that the fact that consumers are not the only kind of stakeholders that we should be concerned about, and not the only stakeholders that protests should affect as well. All of this, I think, falls into sharp relief when we consider the fact that over the summer, the George Floyd and Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 were completely historic. And they were historic for three big reasons. So if you're not kind of paying attention to them now, you ought to be. They're historic because they were the largest protests on record. Between June 1st and June 2nd, between 15 and 26 million individuals were counted as having participated in a physical protest on the streets. This comes from something called the Crowd Counting Consortium that keeps tracks of these things. The other element that made the George Floyd protests distinct and still distinct is that they're highly diverse. It's not just Black Americans that are taking part, not just Hispanic Americans who are taking part, but it's individuals from all across race and ethnic backgrounds that are joining together for this protest. And one element that made this particularly distinct to me is that typically when we think of protests, we think of them as focusing or targeting the government or policy. But what made the George Floyd protest this summer, as well as the initial wave of Black Lives Matter protests stemming from 2017 distinct, is that they not only called out governments and societies, but also business. Obviously, this photo of Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed are from before 2020, but this is an example of something called insider activism or insider employee activism. And I just want to give you an idea of the scale of these protests. Typically, when we measure how big a protest is, we look at media coverage. And a pretty telling figure is something called the protest to politics ratio, such that if a big protest happens, and if you look at the amount of news coverage that's devoted to the protest versus the amount of news coverage that's devoted to politics in general, such as what the government is doing, what your state government are doing, if a big protest happens, that ratio usually reaches about 1 to 1 and never really exceeds that. And so this graph on the right, I know it looks a little bit complicated, but the peaks are basically the peaks of these ratios. The Iraq War protests are included here, Tea Party protests, Occupy Wall Street was pretty high as well. And this is not just protests on the left, but it's also protests on the right as well. Well, if you fast forward to this summer in June 2020, ultimately what you find is that the coverage of the George Floyd protests exceeded the amount of coverage devoted to politics in general. It went to a ratio of 2 to 1. So that's how big these protests were. The other kind of thing that I wanted to mention here, and this comes from a little bit of my work on historical protests, is that we've seen a fundamental shift in the kinds of actors that protesters are focusing on. So what I'm going to show you here is data from 23,000 protest events that I and collaborators have worked with and collected and analyzed over the late 20th century in the United States. And what I'm going to show you is the proportion of those protests over time, over this 35 years, that have targeted governments and the state, and those protests, the proportion of protests that have targeted companies. And
his power just went out. He just texted me, so he's going to go back in about 2 minutes. So maybe while we're doing that, I can either start answering some questions here from the Q&A. So there was a question about remote work, that succeeds now because they're already experienced worker, but what happens in the future when new workers join the company? I think this is a really important point. Part of this community or part of the belonging was actually built over years. So that we now suddenly had to go from working in person to working remote. Virtual works well because we actually know our coworkers, and that's going to be much harder going forward. An aspect of this community is also corporate culture, some sort of a culture that helps also with what's the right thing to do, that helps with coordination and cooperation. And that's an important part in how building that culture is, being together and doing that together. Whether that's possible to do remote is a little unclear. So Dan is back on. So I just answered one of the questions. So Dan, can you hear us?
yes, I can. Can you all hear me?
Yes. All good.
Okay, great. So sorry for that. My power went out, but now I'm back. So I was on a roll there. So I'm just going to keep on going if that's okay with everyone here. So let me make sure that everything is up for me in terms of my slides and everything. And so maybe Stephan, do you mind answering one more question, and then I'll get all set up and share my screen.
Yeah, I was just talking about that, to create that corporate culture. This is not so easy for new employees. The onboarding is going to be much harder. You think about one aspect of also real office work is that there are mentors in the cubicle in the office right next door. They're not going to be there anymore. And we all know that intuitively when you experience going from real work to remote work. While in the past I had to go to Dan's office and ask him something for 5 minutes, now I have to set up a half an hour Zoom call to do the same thing. And that's going to be a very different aspect of working together that I think we underestimate, that in this crisis mode, it didn't fall apart. Everything has to do a lot. And that goes back to that question that we actually already knew how to work together and have this community build on. onboarding new employees and bringing them into the organization is, in my view, much harder if we do that on a virtual basis. Dan.
Thanks so much, Stephan. Sorry, everyone, for the power outage. I'm back now, and I'm plugged in and ready to go. So you heard from Stephan. I was able to catch the last bit of that. Is that employees have a lot of kind of grievances when it comes to understanding how we shift to this new virtual remote work world, and a lot of the protests that you're hearing about right now bleed into other social issues. And one kind of distinct character of the protests that we're accustomed to seeing today on the streets compared with years past has been the focus on getting companies to do things. And so what I was kind of telling everyone here was basically that over time, there are differences in the ways that protesters have kind of targeted the government and the state compared with, say, corporations. And one of the most telling features is that over time, whereas in 1965, about 70% of protests, at least in the United States, were kind of calling out the government, that number has declined to about 48%. Now, concurrently, during this same time, when it comes to protests, whereas about 11% of protests in the United States were calling out corporate actors or companies, that figure in 1995 went to about 30%. This data only goes through 1995, but if you look at other newspaper sources today that cover protest events, this figure is closer to 50-50 and even more of a proportion devoted to corporations as well. There are lots of hypotheses as to why this is the case, but ultimately what this shows is that firms respond to protest pressure. Otherwise, why would there be more protests targeting firms as well? Like I said before, one of the kind of big kind of questions here has to do with how should firms actually treat this idea of activists compelling them to do things that they otherwise would not do. One of the main reasons why firms respond is that perhaps protesters target consumers. They make consumers go on boycotts. We already know that sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't work. What I want to kind of tell everyone is that there are other stakeholders that are not as obvious that protest events target that also deeply affect the ability of a firm to function or to create and capture value. And those kind of stakeholders are numerous, but I want to talk about three examples just to finish to begin with. First are shareholders, another is employees, and then the final one are entrepreneurs or new entrants and competitors. And so when we think about why this is important, it's that firms often rely on all these different stakeholders in order to actually create value and compete in a given market. And so it's not just consumers, but as a leader, you have to think about how activists and their views and grievances affect all of these different stakeholders. So let me give you an example of this from shareholders. Let me just use the simplest way to kind of illustrate this. When it comes to shareholders, there have been a lot of studies about how protesting against a given company affect investors' view of that particular company. But none come through more clearly, I think, than this study that was done in 2007. And what this study looked at was the percent change in cumulative abnormal returns. Those of you with a financial services background have an idea of what this means. It's basically whether a stock price is above or below what we would otherwise expect. And so this horizontal line basically represents no change. Below it is bad, above it is good. And this time window that I'm showing you on the horizontal axis is what I'm going to call a protest window. Or in other words, this is when a protest occurs that targets a given company. And during this protest window, you can see that most of a company's cumulative abnormal returns falls below the 0.9. And so this is decidedly not good for the company. In fact, at the peak of the protests, it also happens to reach one of its most negative points as well. So out of these 342 protests, what these authors ultimately find is that these cumulative abnormal returns decrease by about 16% during this protest window compared to what we would otherwise expect. And based on additional analysis, what they realized was that the reason why these cumulative abnormal returns ultimately decreased was due to negative media coverage that was greater as a result of protests making the news, targeting firms for something that they're doing that would otherwise be undesirable for society. The takeaway here is that protests reduce stock prices on average. It doesn't always occur, but on average, this is what you would likely expect when there's a mass protest against an issue calling out a given company or a given industry. And so that's the shareholder kind of effect. There's another effect on employees as well. And this ties in so clearly with what Stephan was talking about and how employees think about their role within a given company. Now, you've seen all this in the news. Hopefully, you've seen that the tech industry is marred by several different kinds of scandals, but one of the most important ones is how many employees within Google, Amazon, and Facebook are becoming insider activists. These are individuals who are voicing their concerns about values or decisions that they feel that their companies or their employers should act differently on. Now, this is very distinct from, say, labor union activity. This is actually employees thinking about other issues, other stances that a company is taking, their employer is taking, and then calling them out. And remember, this takes a lot of courage and effort. I mean, their jobs are at risk ultimately, but this has become something that many big tech firms have dealt with, and they've up until now have dealt with rather poorly in a very kind of real way. This is really important because ultimately we don't know a whole lot about what this does to the employee-employer relationship. But a really important paper came out this past year by one of our colleagues. Stephan already mentioned her. This is Vanessa Burbano, who this past year published a paper. She also teaches strategy, showing that when an employee's political stance or social stance aligns with a CEO or a leader's political or social stance, then employees tend to be more productive or tend to feel more valued in the workplace. Now, when these are misaligned, that is your employees' kind of view on a particular social or political issue and the CEO's view on a particular social or political issue, when those are misaligned, that actually causes a decrease in productivity. So it's not null, it actually causes employee productivity to go down. And so ultimately, this idea that Stephan kind of discussed, that employees derive meaning from their company's values or sharing their company's values, impact their ability in the workplace. And what ultimately this means is that activism from outside affects employees, but inside employee activism is a signal to business leaders as well that they should not ignore. The final element here is the one that I find the most intriguing, which is that sometimes what protest can do is that it can create new markets and it can create new entrants within a market as well. And some of the best examples of this come from the environmental movement and the green industry, so to speak. Some of you might recognize this car. It's not a Tesla, it's General Motors' early EV1, first edition in 1996. If anyone has seen the documentary, Who Killed the Electric Car, you get an amazing historical perspective about how this car, this electric vehicle, was way ahead of its time. And one of the reasons that held back its market growth, other than certain regulatory concerns, was that it was unprofitable and it didn't have the right kind of political environment to sustain its market. And so above there, you see New York's booming wind farm industry. Wind energy is quickly becoming one of the cheapest sources of renewable energy as well. These things could not have been possible without not just the entrepreneurs or the lobbyists or the legislators who paved the way for these industries to emerge, but also the activists as well. The reason why you see wind energy today as you drive along the highways is because of the actions of the Sierra Club in the 1970s, from 1970 to 1979, going from essentially the streets, that is protesting the streets against companies that might have offended the environment in some profound way, to the suites, that is taking an organized approach in order to actually manifest action on the part of legislators and other policymakers. Ultimately, what this means is that one other reason why leaders should pay attention to the actions of social movements is that they can create entire industries and essentially create a new market at the forefront of which there can be potential for differentiation. So if I were to sum up why business leaders should care about protests, is that on the one hand, it's obvious that when a protest calls out a firm, what this can do, and sorry to use some language from your strategy formulation class, but it lowers willingness to pay on the consumer side. For shareholders, what it does is that it affects firm stock prices, which can induce a further loss of capital, making the firm less competitive. On the employee side, it can reduce their productivity because it misaligns the values that a firm's leaders have and perhaps the values that its employees have. And finally, what it does, and I think the most interesting element here, is that it lowers barriers to entry to new competitors to come in to seize upon the opportunity that protesters have created. So ultimately, this is kind of what I want to show all of you. I'm wondering if you have any questions. I know because of the pause that we had, we're kind of behind a couple minutes, but let me first go to my colleague and Stephan and ask to see if he has any questions that he might be interested in sharing.
There are a couple of questions in the Q&A, and they square well with what I wanted to ask. So one is, you mentioned, which is interesting, like the street going to the suites. So what do we know about what social movements actually do make it into the suite, have an impact on businesses? And there is a question, in the Q&A is like, how do we think about the success of a protest? And then maybe even more basic, that's me not being in that literature. How do we measure what's a social movement in the first place compared to like a lobbying activity? And so, what is a social movement? And then what makes the social movement and protest go into a business or not?
Right. These are two of the fundamental questions of the field. In fact, I spend so much time defining what a social movement is that it often gets lost, that it's not as obvious for many of us encountering some of these issues for the first time. I defined social movement at the very beginning, but let me offer a much simpler kind of discussion of this. What I think a social movement is that it's an organized and collective way of voicing a grievance about an issue through non-institutionalized means. There are three elements there. So the first is that it's organized. There's a hierarchy. There are roles. There are individuals that are coordinated. If you take that coordination, cooperation matrix that Professor Meier showed all of you, a social movement of the ones that I have studied over the past decade or so, they would all be on the top right. There's a high level of cooperation and there's a high level of coordination as well. The second element of this is that it's collective. It represents some element of civil society, not just one person, but entire groups, those who feel as if there's some kind of injustice being done on them. And then the third element is that they exercise their voice through non-institutional means. And so if we could simply vote and have that be efficacious, we would do so. But ultimately, sometimes that doesn't work. And so when it comes to a boiling point, and when the time is right, social movements emerge as a political force, as a way to call attention to some grievance that is otherwise being ignored. And so in some ways, that's really similar to an organization. When you think about objectives, aims, tactics, strategy, social movements are really not that different. In fact, it's the similarities that try to animate a lot of my work. But on the other hand, because they exist outside of institutions, that makes them really different. That makes them nimble, but that also means that they can't respond as quickly to certain tactics as well. And so there are obvious trade-offs having to do with social movements. The second question is a really important one. Why are they successful? How do they become successful? And there's so many answers to this as well. But I think two of the most common reasons come down to number one, resources, and number two, opportunity. Because we can treat social movements as if they're organizations, ultimately, I think the best predictor of whether a social movement's actions get a piece of legislation passed or get a company to cease a certain practice or start another practice comes down to the level of resources that it has. And here, I'm not just talking about donations, but I'm also talking about sheer human power as well. Individuals who are willing to go out and commit to a cause. That bends the year of leaders. And that it doesn't happen randomly either. It happens through a large amount of coordination and cooperation, like I said. This is something called resource mobilization. So think of this as akin to if you're an entrepreneur starting a company and you need to get a massive amount of users. This is almost the same type of collective action problem that protest leaders face. The second element has to do with opportunity. Some social movement organizations and protest groups are extremely effective at marshaling resources, but they just can't get anything done. And a lot of this has to do with the timing. And so there's something that sociologists and political scientists have studied over the years called a political opportunity structure, which are essentially essentially describes what happens when the government is about to change, such as what's about to happen maybe right now in the US government. In democracies, there are constant openings in the political opportunity structure because of elections and because of other means of changing the people who are representing you as leaders. When those times occur, that's when social movements happen to be the most effective in bending the ear of the public. And so those two things combined together, having a political opportunity and as well as having a concentration of resources, ultimately that's what makes protests kind of successful as well. So that's a really important element here.
Interesting. So then maybe I can follow up, and this also kind of reflects some of the Q&A here. You know, it seems like, you know, business and society, if we think about the employee, which I really come from, you know, merges more and more. Now, we just heard, you know, a couple of days ago, Facebook announced, and I think Google did that a couple of months ago, that they're restricting kind of how much employees can talk and participate in social movements or while on work. I have my own view on that, but I want to hear from you whether you think this is a good idea or not.
I think this is such an interesting and also very difficult question to answer. So I'd love to hear your perspective on this, but here's how I put all of this together. Ultimately, it creates a huge dilemma for companies and also activists as well, insiders and outsiders. And so we can start with the premise that the employees in a company, for example, are most motivated and most productive when their values are aligned with a company's leadership's values. And so one thing that gives employees meaning at work is the ability to voice their concerns, the ability to voice their views. And if you take the typical culture, what we think of the culture of a Silicon Valley company, is that there's value. Employees feel empowered, they feel freedom, they feel autonomous as well. These are all elements that keep employees at a job. And so what happens is that when a company decides to strip employees of the very technologies that they use to voice their concerns, they inadvertently might also be undercutting their most productive and important employees as well. I'm not saying that it always happens, but these are not just random employees that are emerging. Occasionally, sure, there might be an employee who's highly disgruntled and who's looking for just a soapbox in order to voice their grievances. But ultimately, employees have to be highly committed to these causes in order to put at risk their own employment. And so when company leaders ultimately decide to squelch some of these avenues of protest or voice, one trade-off that they're thinking about is, well, on the one hand, we're thinking of this as a disruption, but on the other hand, if we ultimately decide to cover up some of these means of protest within an organization, where the uncertainty lies is the spillover on other employment activities. And so it's not just the spillover to colleagues, but also in future hiring decisions. And it's this very uncertainty that often animates the strategic decision. If you don't think that that's such a risk, then company leaders would probably decide for, like Facebook and Google did, to strip internal employees of their internal intranets. But if you think that this will affect your long-term ability to hire and sustain high-quality employees, then this might not be such a good idea. The great kind of misfortune for all of this is that up until now, I don't think any of us have seen a really good model of how to give employees voice in a meaningful way that enables them to challenge their company leaders on these issues that are not necessarily related to labor, and at the same time make them feel empowered in their day-to-day tasks as well. For me, that's the big dilemma, and perhaps it's something that all of you who are watching can join us in kind of researching and understanding. So what is your sense of this, Stephan? Do you think that meaning is they're just brushing meaning by the wayside?
I mean, I think I agree with you that, you know, like voice is just not going away. If you think like employees are unhappy, there are two ways they can express that. They can leave or they can raise their voice. And controlling kind of the discussion at the virtual water cooler, I don't think is a particularly good idea. And that goes back a little bit to when I thought about, and when firms think about like why they would like their employees in the office, and if the answer to it is I can control them better, that's probably not the right reason to have them back. And they need to think about, why is it that I don't trust my employees? What is there another way of empowering them and feeling that they're giving their best? And that kind of goes back to thinking about, why do I bring them together? Why do I want them to be at the virtual or real water cooler and have interaction with each other? And then if I'm afraid that they start to complain or even have, then is probably something wrong within the organization, and just shutting it down is not going to make this go away. So I think, unfortunately, we reached 1:30, so we reached the end of this webinar. I think I talk for Dan as well that we enjoyed this and that we are open. There are many, many more questions in the Q&A and probably many more questions that you haven't typed in to the chat and or the Q&A. You can always reach out to Dan or me. If you're fortunate enough to be in our classes, you can just ask us in the class. If not, just reach us by email, Twitter, snake mail, phone. You can write us a letter. Any way of communication.
Any socially distant way would be appropriate.
It's going to work out.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience, commitment, and encouragement here. It was a pleasure for all of us to do.